We're going to hear from three stakeholders, three folks who come to us from, I think, some really practical perspectives. And I'm excited to introduce them to you in just a moment. After we have a bit of time with each of them, including a Q&A, we'll spend the final 20-25 minutes of the day back in a breakout session just to get into some of the discussion before we wrap up at the end. During this presentation, and of course, throughout the rest of the day, you may find it handy just to have the list of policy options there with you, so that you may direct any of those or keep those fresh in your mind as you interact with our next presenters. So I'm going to start by welcoming to the Assembly our three presenters for the afternoon. Angelo DiCaro is the Director of Research at UNIFOR, Canada's largest private sector union. Lauren Tedesco is the Senior Vice President of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association in Etobicoke, and Dina Ladd, the Executive Director of the Workers' Action Centre in Toronto. And just before I hand the floor over to our wonderful guests, I want to emphasize to all of us gathered here that Angelo, Lauren, and Dina are familiar with probably many of the policy options that we've been discussing here. They've likely grappled with how to wield them. They probably know a little bit about the history of what has worked and hasn't in their particular sector. And they're certainly as interested in what you as members are going to ultimately recommend as part of your mandate on this assembly. So during the Q&A, please feel free to ask them any of the unanswered questions or thoughts you might have, and seek their perspective on which policies they feel might work best. So without further ado, Angelo, let me start with you. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and for bringing your perspective on the voice gap to this assembly. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much. It's really great to be here. As I was saying to Andrew in the break, I've got my 10-minute remarks all prefabbed. If I was going off the cuff, as Dina knows, we'd be here for a few hours. So I'm going to be disciplined this time and focused. So I'll just jump right into it. I'm just really great to be here. I want to welcome, or say hi to everyone. Good afternoon. As was said, my name is Angelo DiCaro. I'm the Director of Research for UNIFOR. I've also been a member of UNIFOR and its predecessor, the Canadian Auto Workers Union, for now 27 years. I worked many years ago as a part-time meat clerk at what was then Dominion stores and A&P supermarkets in Toronto, which I'm sure some people on the call here will remember now, more widely recognized as Metro stores. And I am still a proud member of my local 414. I've been on staff at the national office, serving in a number of different capacities since 2006. And I'm also an alumnus of the Center for Industrial Relations at the U of T, also a graduating class of 2006. So this is very exciting to be here. When I heard about the assembly, it was convened by the CIR. I was very intrigued and really delighted to be speaking with you all today, and also listening to the comments from Dina as well as Lauren. I'd say that interrogating the question of workers' voice in today's economy is a very critical one. It's also the bedrock on which the foundations of the trade union movement was built. I'll say I think a strong argument can be made that democratic and participatory collective bargaining is the most powerful and impactful expression of worker voice that there is. Workers coming together, negotiating the terms and conditions of their work, and withholding their labor if those terms are not acceptable, is maybe the purest expression of worker voice and worker agency in our industrial landscape. Employer-led improvements to the conditions of work are fine, oftentimes cosmetic. Workers might have opportunities to contribute, make proposals and suggestions, but often what's acceptable is only what fits within a predetermined business model and a predetermined cost structure. There can be voice, yes, but without some measure of accountability and assurance that an employer will act on what is said, then effectively there is no voice, just a lot of talking into the wind. There's a correlation between union power, often measured by union density, and positive economic outcomes for workers. In periods of high and rising unionization, such as there was in the post-war economy, workers gained economic security in the form of higher wages, better benefits, and also retirement supports. Standards of living rose for everyone, and workers claimed a greater share of national income. Over the past 40 years, however, the opposite has been true. New rules were made in the spirit of competition and business flexibility to stymie unions and contain collective bargaining and limit worker power in the broadest sense. This included everything from changing rules that governed union certification drives to the benefits workers would receive when they're unemployed. All of that is a manifestation of a disempowering workforce. A new competitive discipline permeates the labor market today. It restricts unions, and by restricting unions, we soften the voice of workers. Now, unions, most of them at least, are vibrant and democratic organizations themselves. Unions are platforms for democratic participation. Union meetings are places of open debate and dialogue and learning. Union conventions, like the one that our union had recently, just a couple of months ago, are opportunities to present transformative ideas, to influence the organization's direction, to prioritize goals. These are spaces of democratic engagement and a meaningful exercise of voice. I speak for myself as a 15-year-old grocery clerk in his new job in a unionized supermarket. I was able to practice democracy through my union. 3 years before I could legally vote in a government election. I could run for a steward's position. I could vote for my local president. That's a very powerful value proposition for building a strong democratic society. More than that, unions often approach their role as stretching beyond the confines of the workplace and the negotiating table. Unions like UNIFOR, there are others, they're very public facing and attuned to social issues, social movements, and legislative matters. To fight to improve working conditions and empower working people, that doesn't start and stop at the punch clock. Work happens in a much larger social and economic context. The decisions made by elective governments influence as much, if not more, the lived experience of working people and their material conditions. And if workers have no voice, no capacity to meaningfully engage in those discussions, then the voice gap grows wider. Unions, therefore, we serve as a platform for collective civic engagement. Unions help workers navigate complex bureaucracies, seize opportunities to inform public consultations, and influence decision-making. Not only does this have a direct effect on outcomes, but it's a learning experience. It's a capacity-building exercise that empowers workers even if they are no longer union members. Knowing how to organize a deputation at a city hall, having the confidence to speak in front of a parliamentary committee, understanding where and how to engage with a local member of parliament. These are essential, basic civic skills that unions help workers develop. It's difficult to quantify the ways in which our union and other worker advocacy groups like the Workers' Action Center have contributed to a more vibrant civic discourse. But I can tell you through the union, working people have not only been empowered to book meetings and organize petitions, but they've actually been empowered to run for government office. And that is a very powerful and a very good thing. Now, I don't want to leave you with the view that the industrial relations structures that exist today, they work perfectly and that there's no need for change. No, what I'm saying is that there is a primacy to membership-driven trade unions as a conduit for workers' voice. To me, that is indisputable. But the rules that enable trade unions to serve this purpose. They demand attention. Last year, overall trade union membership in Canada, it topped 5 million workers for the first time in history. However, since the late 1970s, overall union density has fallen, and specifically fallen in the private sector. Today, just 1 in 7 private sector workers have access to collective bargaining, which is a far cry from what was 1 in 3 workers back in the 1960s and close to the 1970s. For workers in the retail and hospitality sectors, for instance, 2 of the largest and yet lowest paid, most precarious sectors of the economy, which also happen to be some of the most diverse sectors of the economy, collective bargaining is mostly just scattershot. The same is true for temporary workers, migrant workers, gig workers. The overwhelming majority of these folks have no effective access to unions, no say over their working conditions. Some people say this is a reflection of the anemic state of unions, that unions they're not useful anymore and workers don't need them anymore. And I couldn't fundamentally disagree more. The world of work is changing rapidly, but labor laws and standards have not kept up. On the one hand, corporations are larger, they're more complex, they're more global. This creates greater uncertainty and instability for employees. There's a greater reliance on outsourcing and fragmenting work, shedding costs and shifting risk onto outside contractors and workers themselves in some cases. Workers are encouraged now to be entrepreneurs, to start businesses. Workplaces are becoming smaller, more virtual, and workers, whether they want to or not, more independent. This is not the world of work that labor laws were created or envisioned when they were created. And what I'd like to bring to your deliberations is a view that there are limitations to the traditional structures of collective bargaining, particularly under the Wagner Act model, that must evolve and they must expand. Among the list of various voice-enhancing proposals that I know you folks are contemplating, one that UNIFOR delegates committed to explore as part of a new 3-year action plan that was endorsed by delegates at our last convention was the concept of broad-based bargaining, bringing union membership and collective bargaining to as many workers as possible. This trend towards fragmentation of workplaces and bargaining units is very disempowering. I've lived it in my home bargaining unit, and I know this from experience. There is only so much leverage you can exert over a company, say Loblaws, when you are bargaining in a single store independently across a chain of thousands and in an industry with a rising share of non-union competitors. Striking the employer in this case, that's still the big tool we have in our toolbox, but it has a limited effect. And it's likely not what the architects of the Wagner Act had contemplated when this was first developed, but it is still the model that we have in place today. Quitting your job becomes the last act of resistance for workers. And frankly, that doesn't change anything. Expanding collective bargaining in key underserved sectors to take wages and work standards out of the competitive equation, that's the goal. We have to do this in a way that both complements existing successful collective bargaining models and bolsters worker engagement and participation in unions for all of the reasons that I raised above. Canada has experience in this practice, and I'm pretty sure that the folks that you had heard from just prior to this panel explained a lot of that to you. So this isn't new, and there are myriad examples around the world, each in their own context, and some of them I know that you folks have already explored. I recognize that my job here was to present you with union perspectives on this broader question of worker voice. I'm going to steer clear of any discussion right now on the mechanics of broad-based bargaining and the approaches that could be taken, which I think could take us all down a very dangerous rabbit hole, at least while I have the microphone. And this could just go on endlessly for the day. So I am definitely looking forward to taking your questions and continuing this conversation. And of course, listening to my fellow panelists, Dina and Lauren, as the session goes on. So I am going to stop there. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here today.
Thank you so much, Angelo, for that perspective. And I think you're right. These are issues that our members have been discussing a lot already in terms of what the union model can do and how it might be improved or enhanced here. I'm going to turn it right over to the floor. Once again, if anyone has a question, you can feel free to raise your Zoom hand. You're welcome to put that question in the chat. If you do have more of a comment or an observation, prefer that would go in the chat as well. And we'll make sure that our guest, Angelo, and whoever it's directed to get a chance to review that as well. So I'm going to go in the order I see them come up. I see Tracy, you are first.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. I have been a member of UNIFOR and I've also been a member of OAWD. I didn't have the best experience, and a lot of people I know have that negative condemnation when it comes to unions. I know they're extremely helpful and they have a great history. What can we do to try and change that negative condemnation and try and help make unions stronger, basically? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, we still don't have you, Angelo.
We're coming on 3 years of the pandemic, and I've still missed the mute button, so I apologize. I was going to ask you, Tracy, which local or which part of the country are you coming from? When you said you were a UNIFOR member?
Mississauga.
Mississauga. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
Metro.
Okay. All right. Well, where we go? We share a common familial bond in the labor movement here. Yes. Like there's no sugarcoating the realities of this, and these are very important internal conversations that have to happen. I'm again, this is one of those areas that I can go down many different tangents. I'll say one thing just to share with you my view of the challenge here, because your experience and thousands and thousands of other workers' experiences affect how they understand the value of unions. And I remember being in the supermarket for many years, being the steward. I saw young people enter that store. It was like a revolving door. Smart young people, great workers, hard workers, and frankly, very few of them ever needed the services of the union. They just wanted the union to be visible, knowing that there was someone in the store to help if they had problems. But in the cases where some of those folks had a very negative experience, a union rep never called them back. They couldn't get a hold of the local president. They had an issue with a collective agreement, a bit of language that, just despite you explaining the complications of it to them, it just didn't serve their purpose, and they got a bad impression. Well, when you're working in retail, a lot of those folks go on to work in other retail outlets, and most of them are not unionized. And I always saw as the biggest challenge that we faced was when those folks are not having positive experiences. Well, they're taking those narrow experiences and they're bringing them elsewhere. So it becomes even more complicated to organize a very already hard to organize industry, which deflates workers' power, which becomes like this vicious cycle. And so I in my years, I've not found the magic potion on how to do that, but nothing in what I'm saying takes the accountability off of unions themselves to look inward and to make sure that practices are democratic and done properly. One of the challenges, and I'll stop here with it, is that you got to think you've got a situation where we've got over 3,000 bargaining units in UNIFOR, and within those probably just thousands more individual workplaces, and oftentimes people get elected to take on roles and they're not prepared for them. You know, there's not automatic training to be a union steward. And so people learn as they go. And some people do it for the wrong reasons. And it's very difficult to manage that when you are also trying to be a democratic organization. And so I think what we have to do is find ways to bolster our education efforts, to bring stewards who are newly elected into training so that they know what their expectations are and can deliver properly for the members. That can go a long way, but that is a multi-year, multi-generational project, and something that I'd like to think UNIFOR does a good job with, but certainly not, we're not infallible on that one.
All right, thanks very much, much Tracy. Let me open up the floor. Is there anyone else? Feel free to raise your Zoom hand or use the chat if you have a question for Angelo specifically. Jillian, I just saw your hand up. Please feel free to take the floor.
Hey, Angelo, I
Hi.
really liked what you said. I was just wondering if part of the problem is that the impression or the perception of unions has changed over time. Do you feel that part of the solution is also a greater literacy for the average Canadian around what unions do? And is it kind of a two-pronged approach where it's not just about unions doing better internally, but also about, taking that information and disseminating it more widely? And how can we do that?
This is a great question. And I'll tell you, there is so many meetings and educational workshops and things where we get to, and people, they come to this same conclusion, and it is a very astute conclusion that systemically, culturally, there is just a pervasive negative view of unions. I think that's a fair statement. If you were to canvass every single Canadian in the world, we get some polls sometimes that say otherwise, but it is a challenge. And so we've heard ideas surface about, what we should do is build curriculum into schools so that young people have a positive impression of unions as they get older and go through the labor market, and that's good. And people just need to understand better. And I agree. I wholly agree with that approach. But here's where things get complicated. If we're trying to make a more meaningful difference in this, if that's the goal, is that I think when you look at trade unionism in Canada, you look at union density levels, and if you work like most people in the private sector, you are very, very unlikely to actually interact with a union. People interact and form opinions of unions because of what they read about unions, about what they see other people in unions doing. And oftentimes that's taking strike action. That's oftentimes blockading roads because they're trying to win a fair contract. It's a discussion of inconvenience more than anything else. And I think part of it is when you think about a new model that actually pulls people into the collective bargaining fold, now they've got a direct relationship with a trade union. They are serviced by a trade union. They get to vote and make decisions as part of as a trade union member. That is a very different starting point for someone to then have a proper discussion about what they think about unions. And I appreciate Tracy's point, because I actually think that's the more important perspective. She's been in a union environment. She sees the gaps. Let's have a proper discussion about how to fix those problems. But writ large, I think people are not having smart discussions about unions, their failings, or their, the good and the bad. So as we propose, expanding the bargaining model could very well change the tenor of the dialogue on people with unions, because now they're actually more closely connected to them. And I think that would go a long way. So that's what I would say to that. Oh, I see.
All
Dennis
right.
gave me a thumbs up.
Hi.
You probably
you
got some thumbs up there. But before I move on, I just want to acknowledge I have a hand up from Dandy to ask at least one more question. And Dennis, if you have a comment to add, feel free to put it in the chat, or else we'll make sure we circle back, because Angelo is going to stay with us for the rest of our presentations this afternoon. So Dandy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think you called out
you called out a couple of really important, or at least like a really closely connected, questions to my situation. Let's say I'm one of those examples, right? Like my team is global. Like my team, the people who I work with is split between, the United States here, United Kingdom, also Switzerland. So, with 4 different countries, right? I often understand, as you said, that, okay, unions are formed within a geographic boundary, like a region, right? You commented on this remote work, this like very international global model of working. Is there a new model that, that has been surfaced to you or that you know of that people are doing to kind of cover this sort of situations where people can somehow align and come together? Yeah, just curious. And I also work for the private sector office, obviously.
Yeah. Well, maybe a couple of things, and we don't have to get too deep into your personal life, Dandy. So I'm not going to ask any questions, but there's a couple of things here. One is again going back to this idea of fragmentation, which has very much been a systemic strategy and kind of an evolutionary trend in the growth of capitalism. It's very simple. You can see examples of this in so many different ways. And technology has enabled that. And so I guess on the one hand, we talk about fragmentation of work. We talk about people being, excluded from larger workplaces. Things become peripheral. There becomes new challenges about how those people in peripheral industries can not only retain the same benefits and wage structures as kind of the core industries. And in this case, I think of like the auto sector. I look at the auto assemblers who at one point in time, much more vertically integrated with their component parts divisions. And as Lauren, when she joins, and we'll talk, is a product of this, a growing auto parts industry, which is hiving off that work that was not core to building a car. Other people can do that now. And so you'll notice that still the high wage, high unionized density in the auto sector is in the assembly sector on the big global automakers. And then as you go down the tiers of suppliers, unionization becomes less and less, and the wage package becomes weaker and weaker. You're further away from the core. That's sort of just one example. So coming up with structures that break from this idea that, well, now I got to go and organize that 20-member unit who builds the brackets that go to the seats that then eventually go into the car, like those folks, and giving a point of view of how they're going to benefit from joining the union. It doesn't elicit labor market power for them. So even if they get a union, they're still a little bit behind the 8 ball about how they're going to leverage the power to actually win better wages and working conditions. So it's like the model isn't built to succeed, but by stitching these together, by creating sectoral frameworks, for example, of collective bargaining, you can actually standardize some of these conditions of work across the sector. And we've seen that in so many other jurisdictions. And again, I don't know how that necessarily adapts into Canada. There's a lot of questions that have to be answered about that, but that's one way of doing it. The second part of what you raised, and I'm going to assume the team you're talking about, people who are in professional designations, people who are, coming out of university degrees and working in very technical jobs. There's more of that in the labor market as well. A lot of those people, they simply, for whatever reason, don't identify themselves as, working class people, and by extension, see unions as like not for them. And that's another cultural thing that has to be broken down, because there is a lot of highly paid but heavily exploited workers in very technical and expert industries that could very well serve themselves by bargaining conditions of work. And that's another challenge about how we tackle that. So both of those things I took out of your question, and both are excellent questions. And I don't have full answers, but this is sort of the direction that our union is looking forward to.
All right, thanks, Dandy, for that question.